Good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this online session, Revisiting Śāstraic Reasoning, the contribution of Mimamsa and Vedanta to a contemporary Hindu ethics. I'm Monica Sethia, India Associate Country Director at the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard University. We've gathered today in the company of very esteemed panelists, whom I'll introduce shortly, to discuss primarily the paper Mimamsa, Vedanta, and the Case of Śūdras, Is There a Role for Śāstraic Reasoning in Contemporary Hindu Ethics, written by Professor Francis Clooney. Professor Clooney is the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at the Harvard Divinity School. His longer introduction will follow shortly. We are joined by two highly placed scholars of religious studies as discussants, Ananya Vajpayee, Associate Professor, Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS in short, and Patrick Olivelle, Professor Emeritus of Asian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you so much, Ananya, Professor Olivelle, and Professor Clooney for joining us today. Before we begin the session, for those of you joining us for the first time, I'll briefly introduce the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard, in short, also called the Mittal Institute or LMSAI, for your understanding. The institute engages in integrative research, advancing and deepening the understanding about critical issues that are being faced in South Asia. Founded in 2003 to further Harvard University's engagement with South Asia, the institute works with both Harvard faculty and students and the in-region institutions and scholars to disseminate knowledge, build capacity, and inform policy through scholarly exchanges and fellowships, organizing lectures and conferences at Harvard and in the region, today's session being an example, bring knowledge from South Asia to Harvard via research grants, and build a community of stakeholders, and that includes all of you joining us today in this conversation. Without taking more time, we will begin this session. We will spend around 90 minutes together, wherein Professor Clooney will first summarize his paper, that will be followed by comments and questions on the paper by our two discussants. We will open the floor for audience questions thereafter before wrapping up the session. We request everyone to please post their questions in the Q&A box on Zoom. So I invite first Professor Francis Clooney, Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School, to summarize his paper for the audience and the discussants. Professor Clooney joined Harvard Divinity School as a faculty in 2005. He earned his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations from University of Chicago in 1984 and taught at Boston College for 21 years before coming to Harvard. From 2010 to 2017, he was the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. His primary areas of ontological scholarship are theological commentarial writings in the Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of Hindu India. He's also a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology. Thank you so much, Professor Clooney, for giving us this opportunity today to understand your research on the subject as pursued in this paper. Over to you to take forward the conversation.
Okay, I would like to begin by my own expression of gratitude to the Mittal Institute for hosting this session today, to you, Monica, for being our gracious host at this event, for Shreya Majumdar for helping make everything work, and Angarika Dutta also. And here on the American side of the Institute, Hitesh Hatti, who unfortunately can't be present today, but nonetheless has been helpful all along. And particular gratitude to my two distinguished discussants. So Ananya Vajpayee, who also studied University of Chicago, so we have something in common, and we can talk about that some other time. And Patrick Olivelle, one of the great American scholars of Dharma Shastra and related fields, who I think I have admired Patrick since I was a grad student. So this is wonderful to have this opportunity together. So what I'll do is have on the screen, for the sake of our audience, a series of slides in which I will talk about my paper rather than reading the paper. So the genesis for this paper is that I was asked about a year ago to contribute to a forthcoming volume, A Companion to Hindu Ethics, to be published by Bloomsbury. And I was asked specifically to do something about the contribution of Mimamsa and Vedanta to Hindu ethics, potentially, actually. And that, of course, is a very large topic, many possibilities. And as I thought about it, I decided that it would be interesting to do two things. One would be to go back to the sutras, the Mimamsa Sutras and the Uttara Mimamsa or Vedanta Brahma Sutras, and focus on kind of some of the original texts of these as schools of thought. So not the Upanishads per se, and not simply Shaṃkara, Rāmānuja, Madhva, and others, but rather on the sutras and occasional discussions that are occasioned there. And then to take up a case that is not an easy case, deliberately not talking in generalities, but the case of Śūdras, who are discussed in both texts, and I'll go through this in the next few minutes, asking about what do the sutras say and what do the bhāshyakaras say about the adhikāra, the eligibility of Śūdras for participation in the ritual life, the study of the Upanishads, and so on, with the long-term goal of making this presentation and raising these difficult questions about varna, caste, and so on. The question that is on the screen, is there a role for Śastraic reasoning in contemporary Hindu ethics? And I think it has to be a real question. Is there a role for Śastraic reasoning in contemporary Hindu ethics? That question could be answered in the affirmative or the negative. But now let me lead you through some of the materials that I have in about 12 slides, and I'll keep myself to 30 minutes or less. So I decided to focus on the cases, the so-called Upashudra adhikaranas in the Mimamsa Sutras, and then in the Brahma Sutras afterwards. And the first case of the exclusion of Śūdras in 6.1, Adhyaya 6, Pada 1 of the Mimamsa Sutras, the seventh adhikārana, regarding the Śūdras, are they allowed to establish fire altars, to set up their fire altars, potentially with, therefore, the participation in the Vedic rites. And very briefly, for the context, there are 13 adhikaranas in this first adhyaya of the first pada of the sixth adhyaya. The first one is generally about heaven. The second one about humans and not gods or animals or plants have adhikāra for sacrificing. Then there are 4 adhikaranas where women are discussed, arguing that women do have a right and do have adhikāra, but that in 4, 5, and 6, their adhikāra is limited to participation as wives with their husbands in the ritual. This could be another paper for discussion. Then 7 is the one that we'll focus on. Śūdras do or do not have adhikāra for sacrificing. And then there are all kinds of qualifications. A man lacking adhikāra for sacrificing because of poverty can gain adhikāra by acquiring wealth. A person with physical disability may be able to regain adhikāra when the disability is overcome. However, if it cannot be overcome, that person will not have adhikāra. A person who cannot call upon 3 rishis, Gotra rishis, will not have adhikāra for sacrificing. And then 12 and 13. 12 is, I'll refer to 12, that's why it's in red. There is an exception that the Ratakara, who is not among the top 3 varnas, the Dvijas, does have adhikāra for the installation of the fire altar. What does that exception mean? And then there's another case we will not get to, the Nishadapati, who seems to not be of the upper 3 varnas, does also have adhikāra for a certain yajna, the Raudra yajna. So this is the context, and it's important just to remember it, that it's not simply a discussion about varna, but rather it's in the larger context of analyzing a series of cases, as the Mimamsikas always do. So the case we have in 6.1, 25 to 38, so a good 13 sutras or so, is about the exclusion of Śūdras, or their inclusion in the installation of a fire altar. And the key text that we heavily depend on Shabara's commentary, Shabaraswāmin, his commentary from the Taittiriya Brahmana, let the Brahmana install his fires in the spring, the Rajanya or Kshatriya in the hot season, and the Vaishya in the autumn. So this is the text that is up for dispute, and this is very typical in all kinds of Shastraic discussions, and certainly all throughout the 2,700 sutras of the Mimamsa Sutras. A text is put forward for discussion and debate. And so really, clearly, this points out that the Brahmana, the Rajanya or Kshatriya, and the Vaishya do have adhikāra, can install the fire altars, and therefore can perform sacrifices. Well, what about those who are not mentioned? And so there is the issue of silence. There is nothing said in the given text. And if you looked up the Taittiriya Brahmana text, you see that there's nothing there saying explicitly that Shudras do not have adhikāra, but they're not mentioned in the text as given here. And therefore, the debate is about whether they are or are not able to perform the sacrifice, sacrificial altars. And the debate is very interesting, and we simply don't have time to go into it. The Purva Pakshan, in this case, is arguing constantly that the Shudra has the ability, desires heaven, can certainly learn Sanskrit, can perform the ritual action, so why not have adhikāra for the Shudra? And the response, the Siddhanta, which ultimately is the final conclusion as Siddhanta, is that because they are not mentioned in this text, which has been chosen as the text for debate, therefore the Shudras are not mentioned. And if they are not mentioned, then one must assume that they're deliberately not mentioned and deliberately then do not have adhikāra for the installation of the fire altar. So the conclusion, silence about Shudras, indicates that they do not have adhikāra for the installation. One thing that I'll refer to, and we may come back to this in discussion, is that there is no vilification of the Shudras in this discussion. The Siddhanta does not deny that Shudras can be intelligent, very competent, desiring heaven, able to perform the rites. None of that demeaning them, and nothing is said about Chandalas or Dalits or outcasts. Nothing is said about them. But it's simply saying, well, the text says this, and therefore you cannot extrapolate from the text to saying anything more. So it is simply what it is. So this is a very simplified form of putting forward that there is a conversation, and that taking the text in its literal form is an effort to exclude and say that clearly the text ties our hands, nothing more can be said. So the qualification that comes up with this, as I mentioned in the original chart of the adhikāranas of Mimamsa Sutra 6.1, is adhikārana 12, the 12th of 13 case studies in the first pada of the sixth adhyaya. And it seems that in some recensions of the Taittiriya Brahmana, I did not resolve this fully about how these texts fit together. Shabara, in the original discussion of the text as I gave the previous slide, the Taittiriya text, does not mention that there is any more to it. And yet suddenly here in 44 to 50, there is a further addition: let the Ratakara install his sacrifices in the rains or during the rainy season. And the question that arises here, isn't this therefore an exception which would overturn the rule that was established earlier? Namely, now we can say that Shudras, or people who are not among the twice born, do have adhikāra because the Ratakara is able to install the fires. So the question comes up, who is the Ratakara? And again, very, very briefly, because there are 6 full sutras discussing this, is it a caste group? Or, as the Siddhanta is arguing at one point, the Purva Pakshan arguing at one point, couldn't it just be anyone who makes carts or makes chariots? So it could be a Brahmin, a Kshatriya, a Vaishya who makes chariots or carts, and therefore it doesn't necessarily refer to a caste group at all. However, the Siddhanta view is that if you take seriously what the sutras are saying, and the fact that the Ratakara is conventionally and by all normal standards known to be a person who is not of the 3 varnas, therefore one has to say that the Ratakara is an exception. The Ratakara is authorized to install the fire altar, even though not of the upper 3 varnas. 6.150 in the sutra itself, and then Shabara elaborates this, indicates that the Ratakaras are actually of this Saudhanvana mixed caste. And according to Shabara and certain things I looked up, and some of our, we may have refinements of this later, is that the Saudhanvana group is neither a Dvija, twice born, or a Shudra, and therefore it doesn't fully give adhikāra to Shudras, but it also has a group that is outside the twice born who are able to perform a sacrifice. So as I say, this concession does not overturn the earlier judgment that Shudras do not have adhikāra for the installation of sacrifices or fires, even though the Shudras, even though the Ratakara is an exception to the rule that had been established earlier. And I think, again, this is important. It's the same kind of reasoning. Nothing is said about the quality of the persons involved, their humanity, their rights to happiness, but simply saying the text before our eyes says this. And the right way to take the text is to say that the Ratakara is a person who is clearly of a caste group that is not among the twice born, and therefore does have adhikāra. So that's as far as we get with the Mimamsa Sutra version. And of course, there are commentaries upon commentaries explaining this and arguing fuller points that certainly can be gone into in very great length. But I'll turn now to the second case. Over in the Uttara Mimamsa Sutras, or Brahma Sutras, there is a similar discussion of whether Shudras have adhikāra or competence for knowledge of the Upanishads, such as would give them a path to liberation through the great Mahavakyas, Ham Brahmasmi, Tattvamasi, and so on like that. Is that possible? And the odd thing about this pada, the third pada of the first adhyaya of the Uttara Mimamsa Sutras, is that the whole section, unlike in Mimamsa Sutras, is not about adhikāra at all. This seems to be oddly inserted here within the overall project of 1.3, which is a consideration rather of Upanishadic terms which may be synonymous with Brahman, Atman, or not. And so I just put the words here, and we can talk about this if necessary. But a whole series of terms found in the Upanishad, the foundation of heaven and earth, plenitude, the imperishable, the higher versus the lower, the small inner space, the imitation, that which is the measure of a thumb. These are all about Atman, Brahman being indicated by these terms. And in all these cases, the conclusion is that Brahman and not some other reality is the object of meditation. But then there is stuck in the middle here the discussion of whether Devata, the gods, have adhikāra for the study of the Upanishads, and whether the Shudras have adhikāra for the study of the Upanishads. And what's remarkable here is that these two cases seem to be oddly stuck in here, and as I say, seem to be very much out of place. And I'm not quite sure, and I haven't read anything that really explains why this discussion takes place here, except to speculate to say that there needed to be a parallel discussion to the one found in the Mimamsa Sutras, which we considered previously. And for better or worse, either originally or at some point it was put in this context. Here, the discussion goes around, again, a text, which again is the style of the Śastraic thinkers, the commentators on sutra texts. The narrative, the well-known narrative in Chandogya Upanishad 4, 1-3, and other texts are following up, on Raikva and Janashruti, which begins this way in Patrick Olivell's translation: taking with him 600 cows, a golden necklace, a carriage drawn by a she-mule, Janashruti Pautrayana went back to Raikva and said to him, "Raikva, here are 600 cows, a gold necklace, and a carriage drawn by a she-mule. Please teach me the deity that you venerate." But Raikva replied, "Hey you, drive them back to your place, Shudra. Keep your goods and your cows." And so it occurs again a bit later, the word Shudra. And the question arises is Janashruti a Shudra? Because the point seems to be that Raikva is fooling around with him, wanting a very large dakshina for doing the teaching, and eventually will receive the daughter of Janashruti as his wife, it seems, but twice calls him a Shudra. And therefore the question is Janashruti a Shudra, or simply one, by an etymological explanation of the word Shudra, somebody who's given over to grief? That Janashruti is grieving because Raikva is more famous than him, even though Janashruti is a great benefactor and generous person. Raikva is mistreating him, sending him away, bringing him back, and then twice insulting him by calling him Shudra. Or is it simply the fact that Janashruti is a Shudra, and therefore is somebody who is potentially eligible to have a knowledge such as Raikva can teach, which the commentators take to be knowledge of Brahman, Atman, the deity through the Upanishads. And this is at stake, but the conclusion given, In the sutras we have here, in the 1, 3, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, with other complications coming in, is that the pertinent sutras indicate Shudra points to the latter and not the former, namely the person given over to grief is meant here, and not somebody who is a Shudra. Therefore, both Śaṃkara and Rāmānuja conclude the Chandogya text does not show that Shudras are able to receive or have adhikāra for Upanishadic knowledge. And again, here too, for the most part, there is no diminishment of Shudras, there is no insulting, no demeaning of their ability, their capacity, and so on. And the Purva-paksha again and again says, well, they obviously can think, they can understand, they can find self-knowledge, so why not include them? Although there is, and I won't have time to go into this, there is the last of the sutras, Sutra 38, refers to smṛti texts. And this is a rather unpleasant, you might say, supporting note, because the Sutra texts, the Dharma Shastra texts that are given, Dharma Sutra texts that are given, are very negative. The famous texts that talk about if a Shudra hears the Upanishads, then molten lead should be poured in their ears. If they recite the text, their tongue should be cut out. If they memorize the text, they should be pierced with a sword. So very negative texts, and they're simply repeated by both Śaṃkara and Rāmānuja without any comment. No defense, no discomfort with them. And I think what apparently is going on is they're saying our job is to interpret the text, and we interpret the text in this way. They're claiming that it's sort of clear and objective, but of course one can say there are other ways that these very texts can be read. What is the interesting follow-up here is that having in the sutras, 1, 3, 34 to 38 or 39, denied adhikāra to Shudras, there is, however, the offering of alternative paths by the way of jnana and bhakti. Both Śaṃkara and Rāmānuja have long comments at the end of their consideration of the adhikārana. So Shudras cannot study the Upanishads. However, according to Śaṃkara, knowledge of self is liberative, irrespective of bodily identity, and therefore other ways in which this knowledge can be gained, either from a previous life or from personal experience, or through reading other scriptures, smṛti texts, Bhagavad Gita, and so on. There's no reason why a Shudra could not come to knowledge that would be liberative, even if that knowledge is not going to be from the Upanishads, from which they are barred. And Rāmānuja, unsurprisingly, in his long edition, argues that divine grace, the prasada of the Lord, can easily liberate somebody who is denied knowledge of the Upanishads. One does not need the Upanishads in order to be liberated. But what's striking to me in this is, first of all, that in both cases, Śaṃkara and Rāmānuja argue for a strict interpretation of the sutras. The Shudras do not have adhikāra for the knowledge. And then secondly, both of them give a way of exception through jnana or bhakti. And that seems to be their way of thinking, which might be relevant to modern contemporary considerations of the ethics and so on, that they strict interpretation and then looking for exceptions on the side. Oddly, and I won't go into this given the limits of time, a odd further discussion prompted by Rāmānuja and then disciples such as Vedānta Deshika at the bottom of the screen, saying that our position, that grace is the liberative force for Shudras, allows us to hold intact the idea that Shudras cannot have Upanishadic knowledge. Why? Because the Lord stipulates, I give you my grace, you can be liberated, and I also have determined that the Upanishads are only for the twice born. So he says that our position is able to hold this, whereas he said if you follow the logic of Advaita Vedanta, then there's no reason why everybody cannot have the same knowledge as in the Upanishads. And in that case, the Upanishads would simply be unnecessary. They would no longer be required because there would be easier ways to gain this knowledge, whether you are a Brahmin or a Shudra. So this goes on, and I mentioned the Shatadushrani of Vedanta Deshika, 14th century, and the Shatabhushani of N.S. Anantakrishna Shastri, still arguing these points in the 20th century. Now, before coming to a conclusion, I'd like to just have several side issues that complicate things further. And I have here is this first edition Excursus. Would the estimation of varna as a universal characteristic of beings render the two Upashudra adhikaranas irrelevant? Namely, if varna is a universal, or conversely, if it's entirely a social construct, what can śruti possibly add beyond some possible historical evidence? And so this gets into discussions that one finds in Kumara Bhatta and the Mimamsa context, and other commentators worrying about whether varna is a universal characteristic of all beings, and therefore you don't need śruti. You simply say a Brahmin is a Brahmin by nature, a Shudra is a Shudra by nature, and therefore you don't need the śruti to adjudicate any of these issues. It doesn't matter. Or if it's socially a social construct, and there are many great fluidity between the varnas and the jātis, we all know that, then what does śruti add by seeming to have a simplistic view of the fact of having stipulated categories, Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra? I mentioned here, if anyone wants to follow up, the very good article by Wilhelm Hauptfass, Homo Hierarchicus, the conceptualization of the Varna system in Indian thought. Pratap Prabal Kumar Sen, Caste in Classical Indian Philosophy, Some Ontological Problems. That's part of his book, Classical Buddhism, Neo-Buddhism, and the Question of Caste. And Donald Davis, Seeing Through the Law, a Debate on Caste in Medieval Dharma Shastra, which takes up explicitly on Hauptfass's work. And I think it's interesting because how does philosophy and how does sociology, you might say, relate to the discussion of Shastra? Because our Sutrakara and our Bhashyakaras are reading certain texts irrespective of larger issues about anthropology, about human nature, about universals. And they're also not saying what's going on outside, what's going on in the village, what's going on in society as a whole. They're simply saying the text is what matters. We don't deal with history, we don't deal with society, we don't deal with philosophy. I'll just read you this passage from Hauptfass. In order to fully understand this discussion, namely the one about Varna, one other point must be considered. The philosophical Mimamsa was concerned with securing the authoritativeness of the Vedic revelation and the sacred tradition within the framework provided by the doctrine of the means of knowledge. In other words, the intention was to place the Veda alongside other means of knowledge, perception, inference, etc., as a source of knowledge in its own right, capable of conveying contents which would otherwise be inaccessible. The problem of the four Varnas should be seen in this light. To what extent are they objects of Vedic revelation, and to what extent are they accessible to and demonstrable through the worldly means of knowledge and normal human experience? One way to take this, and I'm not attributing this to Hauptfass, is that it doesn't really matter what the philosophy is, or the anthropology, or the sociology, or by extension concerns today about justice issues or human rights, which we have to be concerned about today, but rather from a certain textualist view, there's a way of reading the text. Why read the text so closely? Because it is śruti, it has a revelatory power, and nothing in society or history can take away from that importance. And it's in a sense as if the Mimamsikas and Vedantins are saying, our job is to read the text. We're not here to adjudicate society in more general terms. And in light of that, before my conclusion, I won't read all of this to you, but it struck me that this reminded me of, in the United States context, debates about the role of the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court judges make controversial rulings, and they argue, it's up to Congress to change the law. It's up to Congress to deal with the implications of what we say. We're just here to read the law. The very notion of textualism. And I quote here from Antonin Scalia, deceased, but the leading light on this. Textualism should not be confused with so-called strict constructionism, a degraded form of textualism that brings the philosophy into disrepute. I am not a strict constructionist, and no one ought to be, but that's better than being a non-textualist. A text should not be construed strictly. It should not be construed leniently. It should be construed reasonably to contain all that it fairly means. But while the good textualist is not a literalist, he is neither a nihilist. Words do have limited range of meaning, and no interpretation that goes beyond that range is permissible. My argument, just for the sake of arguing, is that Scalia is thinking like the Mimamsikas and the Uttara Mimamsikas of Vedantins. I'm a textualist, just reading the text, quoting Holmes, who's quoted by Jackson. We do not inquire what the legislature meant. We ask only what the statute means. And I throw this whole discussion, whether we can get to it or not, because it's a lively issue in the 21st century about what judges are to do. And I'm drawing an analogy saying the Mimamsikas and Vedantins are, in a sense, like the judges. And if one doesn't like Scalia and textualism, one is unlikely to appreciate what the Mimamsikas are doing as well. To conclude, a few points, and I won't read these thoroughly. The Mimamsikas, I'm suggesting, are textualists. This is from my paper. It follows from the preceding pages that with respect to the Upashudra adhikāranas in the two sutra texts, neither the Mimamsikas nor the Vedantins can be cast as deliberate defenders of an unjust social order. They do not condone social oppression, if only because social realities as such are not their concern. Śruti is their concern. I go on to talk about what I more or less said about the textualists. Society in general is really not what we are concerned about. Our job is to interpret the text. That's all we do. So at the bottom, they do not want to overthrow the strictures perceived to be operative in the respective adhikāranas. I think they would say, we can't do that because that's śruti, and śruti is not up for us to revise. We can think about all the revisions that happen in reality, but nonetheless, I think that would be the viewpoint. And then here, silence can be relevant. A reading of the Upashudra adhikāranas will quite clearly not turn out to be a leading force in the work of justice. So clearly, if there are ways to read Rāmānuja and Shaṃkara that may seem to help in the work for justice, but the interpretation of the sutras, I think, is not that helpful. However, they may be an allied force because they unclutter what orthodox traditions are actually saying. And I won't read this paragraph, but as I said several times, in their debates and discussions, they do not make nasty claims about Śūdras. They do not demean them as lesser people. They do not call them impure. They do not call them less intelligent, but rather simply say the text says this. We have nothing against them, it seems, but nonetheless, the text says this about their status. They don't have adhikāra, but nothing can be appealed to in either sutra context except those smṛti texts in the Vedanta sutras that would seem to be rather more violent or demeaning. Conversely, silence may actually do harm. And I'm sure we can talk about this, that if the judges on their chairs, so to speak, Mimamsaka and Vedantins, are simply saying the text says no adhikāra for Śūdras, that's all we're concerned about, doesn't that support and lead to other kinds of injustice? Doesn't it end up being a kind of sanction for exclusion and injustice in general? And then finally, does Śruti matter? And I think this goes back to my starting point, writing an essay on Mimamsa and Vedanta for a volume on Hindu ethics today, in which it might be possible to say, well, we don't take Śruti that seriously anymore, except as one among many sources. But I argue, and this is from my draft paper, we cannot understand the pertinence of the two Mimamsas for Hindu ethics unless we take seriously their primary commitment to Śruti as read by the esteemed sutrakaras of their respective traditions. The Upashudra adhikāranas can and should push ethicists of Hindu traditions to reconsider the normative category of Śruti in our more secular world, such as the Mimamsikas and Vedantas would see as at best governed by our world, which is governed by smṛti and local customs, forms of knowledge from the five senses, and so on. Can you counterbalance that in any kind of meaningful 21st century ethics by saying there is knowledge in Śruti that does not come from experience or social knowledge, philosophy, and so on? I suggest that Hindu ethics might benefit greatly from a rehabilitation of the categories of Śruti and smṛti, and a concerted restoration of Shastraic study as a real, but even if limited in its scope. I throw that out for argument. Whether or not anyone would agree with that, we can talk. Appeals to experience, moral considerations, and reasoning without due respect for Śruti will eventually eventuate in weaker and ineffective forms of Hindu ethics. And this is very controversial to say without Śruti, perhaps Hindu ethics will not be nearly as strong as it can be. In light of these two adhikāranas, it would seem valuable for Hindu ethicists to work toward resuscitating the Śruti-smṛti distinction in order to rejuvenate and maintain robustly both sides of the tension. And of course, some of this work has been done. in the work on Dharma Shastra that Patrick Olivelle, Donald Davis, and others have been doing. Of course, this work is being done, and I'm not pretending it's something new, but more of it needs to be done in terms of ethics. Asking the final question, can Shruti still have force today? And with that, I thank you for your patience, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Clooney, for that wonderful summarization of your paper. It was really, really very insightful. And I would like to now invite, I don't know if I am still audible to everybody. I know my camera seemed to be stuck. Okay, I think I'm back on. I could see my camera was not moving, so I wasn't sure if my voice is being heard on the other side. Thank you so much, Professor Clooney. And we now move on to the next part of our session where the two discussants will comment and raise questions on the paper that Professor Clooney just summarized. I invite Ananya Vajpayee, Fellow and Associate Professor at the Center for Study of Developing Societies, a scholar and a writer, working on the intersection of intellectual history, political theory, and critical philology. She's the author of book Critias Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India, which won the Thomas J. Wilson Memorial Prize, the Tata First Book Prize, and the Crossword Award. She's completing a book currently about the modern life of Sanskrit for W. W. Norton. An anthology of her essays about cities is forthcoming from Women Unlimited. She's currently a research consultant with the Nilgiri Archaeological Project at the University of Kent, editor of Arup, Journal of the Raza Foundation, and a visiting professor at Ashoka University, where she teaches a foundation course on great books. She writes widely for newspapers and magazines in India and internationally on arts, culture, politics, and ideas. Thank you so much, Ananya, for joining us. Our other discussant is Patrick Olivelle, Professor Emeritus of Asian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Olivelle received his MA from Oxford University and a PhD from University of Pennsylvania. He was the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington, and the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Texas, where he is currently the Professor Emeritus. He's also the past president of the American Oriental Society and elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He received the Honorary Doctorate of Humane Letters by the University of Chicago in 2016, Prize Foundation Colette Khalid of the Institut de France in 2017, Guggenheim Fellowship in 1996. His major recent publications, that's a very long list, I'm going to read them out loud because they're all very, very impressive. Ashoka, Portrait of a Philosopher King, Yajnavalkya, the Treatise on Dharma, Reader on Dharma, Classical Indian Law, King, Governance and Law in Ancient India, Kautilya's Arthashastra, Vishnu's Code of Law, Life of the Buddha, Buddha Karita by Ashwaghosha, Manu's Code of Law, Upanishads, Panchatantra, and the Ashram System. Thank you so much, Professor Olivelle, and I request you both, Ananya and Professor Olivelle, to please share your comments on the paper and also if you have any questions for Professor Clooney.
Actually, Monica, before you came, we had agreed that Patrick would go first and I would go last.
Sure. Okay. Over to you, Professor Olivelle.
Thank you very much, Monica. Let me read my comments just to save time. At the outset, let me say something about the deep and broad body of work that Professor Frank Clooney has authored over, I'm not sure how many years, Frank, but maybe at least 40. I think modern scholars working on ancient scholars from a different culture owe them this much. First of all, the courtesy of taking them seriously and on their own terms. And secondly, to treat them with respect and dignity. These are traits that distinguish Frank's work on some of the most abstract of ancient Indian intellectuals, those especially from the exegetical tradition known as Mīmāṃsā. In the paper under discussion, Frank not only takes them seriously, but also thinks that they have something to say to modern society, especially to the contemporary Indian society as it seeks to create a more just, a more moral and equitable society. Given the time constraints, I will restrict myself to some comments and critiques, which hopefully will be of some use to Frank as he revises and refines his erudite paper. Frank's paper explores the ways in which Brahmanical theologians attempted to be inclusive of Shudras within the Vedic ritual context. It is principally a close reading of two sections of two major hermeneutical texts of Purva and Uttara Mīmāṃsā. However, given its broad goal of exploring Hindu ethics for contemporary society, several issues and questions came to mind. First, whether the social structure of varna and jāti in ancient India on the ground is the same as in the texts. Historically anchored studies should influence how we interpret texts themselves. The scholarship over the past quarter century shows that the varna system was a political theology rather than a reflection of the on-the-ground social reality. I want to draw attention to two sources that are different from the dominant Brahmanical discourse. They are the inscriptions of King Ashoka and the treatise on statecraft by Kautilya. In Ashoka's writing, there is total silence about the whole varna jāti system. The system, as well as any of the names of the varnas, are absent in his writings. The term Brahmana does occur, but he is simply a pashanda, a religious category rather than a social one. Its counterparts are Buddhist and Jain monastic orders and not Kshatriyas and Shūdras. So we can understand Ashoka's silence on the varna jāti system in two ways. First, it could be evident that Ashoka did not know anything about such a system. It was unknown to him. Second, he knew about it, but did not consider it significant enough to record in his inscriptions. In either case, his silence undercuts the Brahmanical presentation of the system as fundamental to the functionings of society. There is one other possibility. Ashoka simply did not have the opportunity to mention the system. That is certainly a possibility encapsulated in the dictum, silence is not evidence. But the Ashokan dharma ethic is built on the cultivation of social and familial relationships. As I try to demonstrate in my recent book, the self relates to a spectrum of individuals, including relatives, friends, workers, and slaves. If the varna system was central to social life, then one's relationship to people of other varnas or one's own varna would have been also central to an Ashokan ethic. But it was not. As for Kautilya, on the other hand, the varna system is discussed at a meta level, I would say, and only once. But it never shows up in the central body of his work. For example, for him, Shudras are simply agriculturalists. They are freemen and are even called Arya, a category reserved by Brahmins for the Brahmins in the Dharmashastras. And the Brahmanical exceptionalism, so prominent in the Dharmashastras, is notably absent. So we must question the accepted wisdom of taking the Brahmanical presentations of the Varna system as social reality. Furthermore, there appears to have been dissenting voices within Brahmanical political theology. Brahmanism was not monolithic. Can we see some of the Purva Pakshas of the text Frank has examined as these dissenting voices? We even have a name attached to one of them, I think Badri. Not all Purva Pakshas are straw men used simply to knock them down. I think closer and more serious examinations of these dissenting voices may help us construct suppressed and silenced voices, especially those more sympathetic to what we call the subaltern. If the Varna system is not a sociology, but a political theology constructed by Brahmins, then we would have to look at what seems like abstract philosophies to be actually activist political theologies. Would our views of these texts say about Shudras change if we evaluate them in that light, if we take them to be pursuing a political agenda. Like the contemporary judges that Frank referred to, I only interpret the text, maybe simply a camouflage for an activist judge or theologian. Frank's analysis shows the complexity and the porous nature of the varna jāti system. They had to invent more and more exceptions besides the ones that he has examined. The Dharma Shastras offers many more. Manu, for example, exempts many kinds of Shūdras from the prohibition against accepting food. 4:253. A sharecropper, a friend of the family, Kulamitra, and one's own cowherd, slave, and barber. Among Shūdras, these are the ones whose food is fit to be eaten. Frank says, and I quote, given the nature of the adhikaranas in question, the question of varna as raised here does not directly shed light on the status and indeed the plight of Chandalas and related outcasts, today's Dalits. And again, I quote, but the case for the claim that the adhikaranas in question pertain to the problem of wholesale discrimination is weak, and I quote. On the first, I think we cannot take adhikaranas of Mimamsa Sūtras in isolation. Much of the ancillary work, especially the Dharma Shastras, hinted at in Sutra 38, speak clearly about Chandalas and what is called Antyaja, the lowest born. And that picture is not pretty or pleasant. If we take these texts into account, I think they support strongly the wholesale discrimination of the lower classes of society, including Shūdras and Chandalas. And we must not forget that the strict endogamy scholars associated with the caste system was also historically suspect. Up until at least Manu, that is the 2nd century CE, the texts themselves permit hypergamy, that is, upper class men can marry lower class women, including Shudra women. So a Brahmin can get his wives from 3 lower classes. It is only when we come to Yajnavalkya, writing in the Gupta period, that the prohibition against marrying Shudra women came to be enforced, at least in texts. I think there is also some new genetic research that support the view that strict caste endogamy can be dated to the first few centuries of the Common Era. And now to my second and final point. I want to explore further a few broad issues raised by Frank's paper. Recently, I wrote a paper similar to Frank's, but with 2 differences. First, it dealt with justice. And second, it was purely a historical investigation without any attempt to relate it to modern contemporary social reality. The question I addressed was, can one apply the category of justice to ancient India? Or, for that matter, to any other ancient Indian society where social and legal inequality were an integral part of the social and religious structure? I said in that paper, and I quote, almost all modern theories of justice, from utilitarianism to John Rawls' justice as fairness, are anchored, first of all, in the principle of social and economic equality and of individual liberty, at least aspirationally. Amartya Sen, one of the few scholars to deal with justice in India, claims that, and I quote, every normative theory of justice or social arrangement that has stood the test of time seems to demand equality of something. This is stated clearly in the first principle of his moral philosophy by John Rawls, and I quote, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties, compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others, unquote. If you follow these scholars, then apparently the category of justice cannot be applied to ancient India, with its system of varna and jāti and inherent inequality among the individuals. Under a definition of justice that requires social equality, not just Indian, but all pre-modern societies are by definition unjust, given that social hierarchy involving inequality is the foundation of almost all ancient social configurations. I found inspiration in the works of the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas and his exploration of justice as virtue. He wrote within the context of a deeply unequal medieval European society. I try to show that justice is a category that is indeed applicable, at least in a limited way, to ancient Indian society and legal framework. At least we can say some things are just, some things are unjust within the context of the legal frame. I bring in my work only as a parallel to and a contrast to Frank's own work in using classical Indian categories developed in Mimamsa and Vedanta to construct a contemporary Hindu ethic. I was not doing that. I was simply trying to understand whether we can talk about justice in ancient India. Mine was simply a historical undertaking, a thought experiment. Frank wants to do his historical work, but seeks something more, to find inspiration in those ancient categories and arguments for a modern Hindu ethic. This is where I think he may encounter some problems. The first question I have concerns agency. Who will construct the Hindu ethic for contemporary India? Will the non-Brahmins, the subalterns, especially the many communities falling under the umbrella of Dalit, have a role? And the Shudra communities, especially in the south? If they do participate, how can the Brahmanical text with the Shruti, Smrti, or various Shastras, such as the Purva and Uttara Mīmāṃsā, that have either excluded them or spoke disparagingly of them, have any role to play? I'm now thinking especially of the Dharma Shastras, which are closely associated with Mimamsa. And why should these communities privilege these texts? The categories of Shruti and Smrti themselves are deeply theological. Much like the more universal categories of scripture and canon, they are neither historical nor scholarly categories, although they are often used by scholars as shorthand terms for categories of text. Further, we may question whether these categories are acceptable or accepted by all Hindus. Unlike the Bible or the Quran or the Buddhist Tripitaka, the Shruti Smrti are not the scriptures of all Hindus. Some Hindus were traditionally not permitted even to read the Shruti. So how should we expect the large segments of the Indian population, which were excluded from the very theologies that created these categories, how can we expect them to internalize and use such categories in creating their own moral philosophies? A final point. In late medieval times, we have several books of the Dharma Nibandha genre that claim to be describing the Dharma of Shūdras. These are invariably authored by Brahmins. I recently produced a searchable transcription of one of them, the Shūdra Kamalakara of Kamalakara Bhatta, written in the first half of the 17th century. I think Ananya has worked on several of them. The issue here is twofold. First, why did a 17th century Brahmin find it necessary or lucrative to write a book about Shudras and other low-caste people? Second, and from Shudra's perspective, can such a book be taken seriously by the very people to whom it is addressed? Or, to make matters worse, is it really addressed to other Brahmins to tell them how they should expect Shudras to behave? The parallel to this are texts dealing with Stri Dharma, the Dharma of women, which are really addressed to Brahmin intellectuals about how they can use their influence to control the lives of women. This follows the general and oft-articulated principle that only Brahmins are permitted to Dharma. With that, I will stop and give the floor to Ananya.
Thank you so much, Professor Oliver. And then Ananya, over to you.
Thank you. I have to say that I was very excited to be invited to be a discussant of this particular paper because I devoted almost the entirety of my doctoral research to the exact text actually that Professor Clooney is reading today. And so I've really spent a long time thinking about these and reading and revisiting them from various different perspectives. And these are, of course, taken from the very small sections and chapters concerning the Shudra the exception made for the Shudra in the general context of Vedic knowledge and Vedic ritual, from Badarayana's Brahma Sutra and Jaimini's Mimamsa Sutra and their respective bhashyas by Śaṃkara and by Shabara, and then subsequent subcommentarial literature, which is quite vast. What this paper asks us to consider is that disallowing the Shudra from access to the Veda and everything that is entailed by access to the Veda, including Vedic knowledge, the utterance of Vedic mantras, and the performance of Vedic rituals, all of these restrictions pertain only to Shudras and not, as he says, as he argues, to Ati Shudras, which is the term, blanket term that our shared teacher, Ron Inden, would use to describe Antyajas, Shudra Samanas, Chandalas, etc. So these restrictions are limited. That's one point. The second, that the restrictions are confined to Vedic study and Vedic rituals and not generalized to other contexts in which Shudras may participate. Third, that interpretations that reinforce these restrictions are concerned only about reading the texts correctly and accurately, not about persons in the real world to whom these restrictions may apply. Fourth, that such exceptions are made within the texts. Some exceptions are made within the text themselves, such as the adhikāra, the maker of the chariot, the Nishada Sthapati, that is the king or the ruler of the Nishada tribe, suggesting that there is some give as regards a blanket exclusion of all Shudras from Vedokta rituals. Professor Clooney points out again and again in his paper that Mimamsa and Vedanta texts are thus concerned rather with the coherence of their own arguments and not with the humiliation or exclusion of this or that class of person or social group. Their logic is legalistic and its empirical consequences are not of great interest to the authors of these texts. Now, I think the problem of anachronism is a problem that all philologists face, and all of us who spend our life reading texts from the deep past very closely in our present time have to contend with this problem about where do we bring our perspective to the table? How do we enter into the world that these texts may have emerged from or may have been relevant to without finding ourselves at odds with what the texts are arguing? And that is very much the case in this context. And why does this question even come up here? It's because Professor Clooney specifically mentions that he wants to read the Mimamsa and the Vedanta sources on the Shudra in as much as he wants to see what can be salvaged for a contemporary Hindu ethics. So in other words, we do have to apply today's yardstick to measure these ancient discussions for how ethical or unethical they may be, per se, in as much as it is at all possible to dehistoricize texts, which I personally don't think it is. So I think, you know, initially, I too, as a reader of these very same texts, did read them from my point of view. And I looked at them as being incompatible with standards of justice, of equality, of egalitarianism, and other such moral standards by which we live our lives today. And I found them to be, quite frankly, disappointing, painful, sometimes shocking. And eventually I arrived at a position which I happen to share with none other than B.R. Ambedkar, who has written extensively on Shūdras, a position of outrage. And Ambedkar, of course, reacted to texts like these, not simply with criticism, but it led him to really ask for the annihilation of the caste system as such, because it essentially sets up such unsurpassable differences between different social classes. And in today's day and age, we do take the caste system, the varna system, the varna jāti system, varnashrama dharma, and so on, chaturvarnya, to be a system of socially constructed identities. We do not accept that it has any biological basis. We do not even accept that it has, any kind of ontological universality to it. And we are certainly troubled by it again and again. In fact, in all of these texts, there is a certain path dependence of exclusion, of a series of exclusions. And it all begins with the primary denial of the Upanayana, the sort of the primary ritual of social rebirth into a Savarna status to the Shudra. And from there, we come to the denial of the sacred fire, from that, the denial of the initiation into Vedic teaching by a teacher, then into the acquiring of Vedic knowledge, and finally, the ability to perform Vedic rituals. So it all begins with the denial of the Upanayana. And look at Ambedkar's terminology. He calls this denial the atom bomb of the Brahmanical system. Of course, he's writing his book, Who Were the Shūdras, in 1946, right after, the first atom bombs at the end of World War II. And this may seem like an excessive sort of, description to us. But I think what it is trying to capture, what he is trying to convey, is the devastating effect of debarring the Shudra from this primary baptismal rite of entry into Savarna status, the ritual of social rebirth, as it were. And from then on, all the sort of tricks of Śastraic reasoning, all the kind of syllogisms, the Purva Paksha's arguments, the Siddhanta Paksha's justifications are not able to sort of overcome this essential exclusion of a class of persons from the capacity to enter into a certain kind of religious, social, and moral. That once access to Vedic study, Vedic utterance, and Vedic ritual is closed, the tradition develops other routes to allow the Shudra the possibility of realizing the desire for moksha or liberation, right? And these are the paths of jnana and bhakti. And Professor Clooney also discusses these as emerging from within the Śastraic tradition at later stages, long after these very old texts. But I would say I think it's slightly like reinventing the wheel, to go back to the most ancient Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa sources for these particular pathways to moksha, which are potentially available to people of all descriptions. Because for many centuries, the bhakti movement and the bhakti texts, whether north or south or in any of the different languages of South Asia, have already developed this set of paths and opened those doors to all sorts of classes and castes and genders of people. And we're not really, going to get much by sort of milking the aged cow of Mimamsa when it comes to the egalitarian possibilities of the bhakti marg or the jnana marg. Those are much later historical developments, and those have a different set of texts associated with them. So that's where we should be looking. Now, I myself, when I found this sort of discourse within the Shastric tradition, especially in the Dharma Shastra on the Shūdra, I was, needless to say, very troubled by it. And I formulated at that time in my work this idea that we need a poetics to specifically read Shudra Dharma, texts of Shudra Dharma, Dharma Shastra that deals with the Dharma of the Shudra. Why is this? Because Shastra and Dharma both pull us in the direction of order, systematicity, rule-bound discourse, and a kind of rationality that is almost unassailable. And on the other hand, the object to which this discourse is being directed, the Shudra, is an object of contempt, an object of exclusion, an object of humiliation. And so the language that you quoted, Professor Clooney, from the Smritis, that the Shudra is a cremation ground. If he should utter the Vedic utterances, his tongue should be cut off, and if he should hear them, then his ear should be filled with molten lead. If he should remember these texts in his mind, then his body should be split in half. The Shudra is filthy, is polluted, and so on. The violence of that language I found at odds with the systematic and sort of perfection-oriented nature of Shastra as an enterprise. And I find Shudra Dharma texts to be completely schizophrenic in this regard. And the torque of these equal and opposite forces of violence and humiliation on the one hand, and order and systematicity on the other hand, I found made this entire enterprise quite incoherent and perhaps in some sense somewhat pathological. I found it very, very difficult to deal with. And how do we evaluate texts of this order? That is a question which I had. You suggest at the end, and I think this is the real takeaway from your paper, is that not necessarily to defend or reject, not necessarily to, try and salvage something of value from what is unsalvageable, but really as responsible readers and as ethical scholars ourselves, we need a practice of critical empathy towards the texts with which we are engaging. And I find that to be an extremely valuable intervention that you make. And I myself, over the years, have gone back to different parts of the Sanskrit literature, not necessarily the Dharma Shastra or the Shudra Dharma or the Shastric texts of Mimamsa and Vedanta, but other parts of the corpus with critical empathy. And I have found a number of treatments of the question of the Shudra that are not at all so problematic. In fact, that are often, evidence that the tradition has the capacity for self-correction, for autocritique, for moral ambiguity as regards what is coming down from the Shruti, and that if you take characters like you mentioned, Janashruti and Raikva, their story from the Upanishad, You take another story from the Upanishads of Satyakama and Gautama, right? You find a number of characters in the epics. For example, Shambhuka and Shabari and Guha in the Ramayana. You find Vidura and Ekalavya in the Mahabharata. You find the epic poets themselves, Valmiki and Vyasa. A number of these quote unquote problematically or ambiguously or not quite clearly Shudra characters emerge in the narrative and the didactic literature. Primarily, I would say in the Upanishads and the epics. Now, why in these two locations and not in the Shastra? I think in the epics, because the agency of the two avatars of Rama and Krishna, right, the grace of God, as it were, allows certain kinds of personal transformation and social mobility to these characters. They interact with Rama or Krishna and something changes for them, for their condition. So there is some sort of an implicit idea of grace that is working there. And you speak about it with regards to Rāmānuja and the Vishishtadvaita. Similarly, in the Upanishads, there it's not the intervention of a personal God or divine grace of any kind. But I think there we are dealing with very early stages of society and social order, as Patrick was saying, and we may not have such a rigid idea or theorization or political theology, as he said, of varnashrama dharma that we have to contend with. And so identities are more fluid and negotiable, and that's what emerges in the stories of Janashruti and of Satyakama, especially from the Upanishadic sources. So an attitude of critical empathy with regards to approaching the tradition, the ability to distinguish different parts of a very varied, complex, internally often dissonant tradition, and finally, I think the awareness that we are engaging in acts of translation, right? Whether we are crossing over into a different time in history, or we are making a difference of the language that we're entering into, or there are cultural or social or other kinds of differences. We have to, as responsible readers, we have to be aware that we cannot confuse and conflate our own position and our own needs and expectations with what the text actually has to offer. And if we are able to do this, if we are able to read in this way, then I think we can walk away with something valuable, even from texts which, from our ethical perspective, are highly problematic. And I think, I'll just stop here, but I want to say that this is something we encounter much more commonly when we look at texts from a gender perspective, right? Texts from the deep past are almost always highly patriarchal, misogynistic, sexist. And does this mean that we just reject them altogether? Or are we still able to read them for what they have to offer us? And caste is like that. The category of the Shudra is something that really brings all these questions into a very sharp focus for modern readers. And we have before us an exemplary reader and critic like Ambedkar to show the way. But then what next? Beyond the annihilation, beyond the atom bomb, how then do we re-enter and re-engage with a tradition that continues to be meaningful for many people? And I think as a theologian and as an ethicist, you probably have that question very much on your mind. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ananya. I don't know if Professor Clooney, would you like to respond to any of the comments from either Ananya or Professor Oliver? I'm just mindful of time that we have 12 more minutes for the session and we have just one question from the audience, but I do want to give you a platform to respond.
Yeah, maybe I could just say briefly several things.
Sure.
One would be I'm exceedingly grateful to both of you, Patrick and Ananya, for raising all these wonderful questions that I need to think about. So thank you. That's the first point. Secondly, I hope it's clear that when accepting the task of writing an essay on Mimamsa Vedanta for a volume on Hindu ethics, I was looking for a particularly hard case. And I think there are other ways to think about this. One, I work on Sri Vaishnavism too, and one can go on talking about prapatti and accessibility of all people to the bhakti and so on like that. There's so many easier cases. And then I looked at a good bit of P.B. Kane's work on the Dharma Shastra and so on like that, looking into Mahabharata and Ramayana and all these difficulties, but also great stories and so on. But I was looking for Mimamsa Vedanta in the hard case of the Sutra text and the Sutra text in the hard case of clearly an allergic case, like about the varna. And so thank you for raising the questions to make me think about this. So briefly, let me just tabulate a few points and I'll stop so we do have some time left. Patrick, I'd love to read that other paper that you said you have written, so that would be wonderful to read. I think I'm aware, and you're aware, Patrick, I'm coming at this all from a Roman Catholic background. And the Roman Catholic Church has its own problems about tradition, about exclusions of women from ordained ministry, hierarchical structures, and so on like that. And one of the hot debates in Catholic theology today is what to do with the Middle Ages, what to do with Aquinas. And the trajectory to think about political theology, and that everything needs to be read as political theology, including the four Gospels, including the Torah, including everything else, is seen by some, and I'm not saying myself, is seen as a dissolution of tradition. And that if there's no tradition, then there's no Catholic Church. And I'm thinking, is this the case in India that there has to be a place for this kind of reasoning, and that the turn to political theology seems perfectly legitimate and just, but nonetheless, what does it leave us with when the solidity of the debates in the adhikāranas dissolves into a host of other issues? I agree, the superficial or the alleged boundary, this is just about śruti, this is just about the text, and everything else is left out, is artificial. But I think that's what they're doing. And as you said, Patrick, the Purva Pakshans bring in ideas from the outside. And I think much more, by me and others needs to be said about that. But nonetheless, they make that distinction, just as in other traditions. I would think in rabbinic tradition about how to read purity rules, and Islamic tradition about certain, prohibitions in the Quran, and so on and so on. The stipulation, well, these things are simply true, regardless of political conditions. I'm not sure we know what to do with that kind of claim today. And therefore, I keep thinking about that. And then the whole issue of justice, I think it's a very good thing to be thinking about parallels with Aquinas, justice and virtue. Can we retrieve in some way the debates that I put forward in the two adhikāranas as having anything to do with justice? Or is it anachronistic, as Ananya says, to go back looking to these texts? And in some sense, why bother? Because that can be an issue to be concerned about. What's at stake in going back? And part of the thesis of my paper is that it's worth going back and taking these things seriously and reading them and training and thinking about them, because there'll be a loss to contemporary ethics if these are simply put aside without being understood. And I think you both agree on that. And again, very briefly, Ananya, so your work was not, unfortunately, was not known to me in drafting the paper. So I appreciate very much the things you pointed out and the things you sent me, which I will certainly be taking into account. I think the anachronism idea of reading our concerns back into their concerns, and my own constructive work of reading Antonin Scalia along with Mimamsikas and Vedantins, is certainly alert to the, the times in which we live and divisions in American society. That kind of thing can be done, whether it's a good idea to do or not. But why bother with doing this when there are other texts that we can read more usefully? Your idea of critical empathy, looking at these texts with a sense of what they are about and their severe limitations, and then looking to other texts more coherently, redemptive sources, just as New Testament scholars might look outside the New Testament for texts that didn't get into the New Testament that actually speak more to justice issues than some of the biblical texts. And I think finally then, because we do have to stop, I have to stop talking, is the kind of schizophrenic intellectuals. And there's a sense in the Mimamsikas and Vedantins, this kind of cool rationalism. And all we're doing is arguing the text. And then as in, it troubled me greatly in the Vedanta text, in the smṛtis last Sutra 38, 1-338, this list of these horrible, the molten lead in the ears and the cutting out of the tongue. And the fact that even Rāmānuja and Śaṃkara both simply accepted them and didn't debate them. I think some contemporary Vedantins I've read writing in Sanskrit seem to back away from them and say, well, that's not the way we think today. But they, in their time period, just give the text and then move on. And then how do they manage to say these things? And then after they've made the arguments and said, that's absolutely clear, no adhikāra, then they go on talking about jnana and bhakti. What are they about? And then what I didn't do, what are the social conditions under which Śaṃkara bothers to write a bhashya, Rāmānuja bothers to write a bhashya, and so on. So I do want to stop there without doing justice to your sets of comments, but I thank you very much to both of you for pushing the issues and showing how difficult it is and how we should not try to escape easily from facing up to what these things tell us or challenge us with. Back to you, Monica.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Clooney. I don't know if Ananya or Professor Oliver, if you have a follow-up comment or a question.
I had a couple of just quick things. I should have said them while I was speaking. One is that P.V. Kane, whom you quote at length in the paper, it's interesting, but he is a contemporary of Ambedkar's. And, they're both in Maharashtra, and they're coming at this from very different perspectives. But Kane going to the Mahabharata or the Puranic sources as a way to open up some part of the Sanskrit literature to Shūdras and others is not that different actually from the original texts, which also say that really the restrictions only apply to the Veda and the Veda proper, and all these other kinds of texts could perhaps be heard by at least, or their benefit could accrue to Shūdras and so on. So that's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to say is that the bone of contention in all these discussions, whether ancient or modern, is in a sense the realm of specialized knowledge and higher education, if you want to call it that. And it continues to be that. That is where the rub is. That is where all the debates around Brahmanism, Brahmanical access, caste society, Ambedkarite radicalism, it really comes down to, who gets to go to university. And today it's not the Vedic teacher that we're fighting over. But, when Rohit Vemula, the Dalit student from Hyderabad, committed suicide in 2016, Ekalavya made a great comeback in the protest against that act of suicide, saying that he is a modern day Ekalavya and he's demanding his right to a university education. Despite his caste situation. And immediately, there was a connect across centuries to a reference that really came out of the deep past because of the continuity of access to knowledge, access to education, that is still very much a living issue for Indian society, which continues to be a caste society.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we... Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Patrick, did you want to add anything or...
Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute, Professor Oliver. If you want to unmute yourself.
No,
Last
I don't
2
have
minutes,
any.
so I just want to be mindful of time. So if you can be
Yeah.
quick. Yes.
I'm fine. Go ahead and
Oh,
get
fine.
the.
Okay. Right. I still want to take. We have 2 questions, on the board, and I think we just have time for one quick question. I think it's a very, very difficult question what I'm reading, but anyways, I'll give the opportunity to any one of you to answer this if you think you can. This is question from Hitesh. This is another Hitesh Natyal. He says, we always talk about the discrimination that took place in ancient period and blame the Brahmins for that. What about the modern day where we witness class differentiation? According to me, it's not easy to develop a society that's away from the discrimination. In ancient era, societal status is one the basis of varna or caste, and in modern era, it's finances. Kindly suggest, with some examples, how can we eradicate the difference in the society and will be able to make a society with equality? I know it's like, well, anyways, I'll let any one of you want to give a shot responding to it briefly. We're almost touching the closing time, but just a very quick response from it.
I think you might also read the second question or just read it very quickly.
Okay, yeah, but we're just out of time, so I didn't want to get there. I can read the second question, which is, when you're looking at the relevance of ancient texts such as the Mimamsa Sutra in the current age, why was the adhikāra of Sūdras to install and initiate fire altars the point of concern? I was under the impression that there are much relevant aspects in the ancient texts that can be correlated to the current age beyond rituals. I contend that rituals have little to do with ethics and morality, and disentangling moral dilemmas would be a better approach in answering if Shruti is applicable today or not. And he then adds as a comment that he or she is in agreement with Patrick Oliver's comment. The reality on ground is anyways very different than how it appears in texts. Any
I would just
comment?
briefly on the second one, and then Patrick or Ananya might maybe on the first. I think again, I was tasked in writing my essay to work with the Mimamsa and Vedanta, and that doesn't exclude that there are other interesting things to talk about. And then, as I said, having to write an essay of no more than 7,000 words, going for a really difficult case, and that one could do a much broader rethinking of Mimamsa, the 900 cases of the sutras in light of contemporary issues and so on. But I think I was going for a hard one. And people can say, as Rāmānuja complained about Śaṃkara, if you follow the logic of knowledge, who cares about the rituals anyway? And this is in the 11th century. So it's one way to say we don't care about whether we have those rituals and so on. But I'll leave the first question to Patrick or Ananya.
Yeah, I think with regard to ritual and morality, who said that ritual is not morality? Yes, from our perspective, it is not. But if you go to what they were doing, the word morality didn't exist, right? We had to look at a native word, and the one comes closest is dharma. But all of ritual is called dharma, after all, right? In other words, we are asking a question, what is important? But what is important for us in the 21st century may not be the same as what was important for somebody living 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. And I think that's why I said we have to treat the people we study with respect and courtesy, take them seriously as they are, not as we would wish them to be, right? That does not mean that we are a problem for Frank, is that does not mean that we have to then accept that and enact that in our own lives today. Right? That's a whole different ball game. Historically, we can study that. And I think that is an important point. Ananya, I don't want to go on too long.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have the time. Do we, Monica?
Well, we don't. We're actually already 3 minutes over. But if you have a very, very quick thing that you want to say, then it's absolutely okay.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to go to questions of social or historical reality based on these specific sutra texts and their bhashyas that Professor Clooney has picked. it's almost impossible to judge just from these very cryptic sutras. And they do refer to rituals because, as I said, there's a path dependence. Rituals have an entailment in terms of, they also have presuppositions, but they also have entailments in terms of what follows from them in terms of your social status, your capacity for participation in social and religious life, and so on. So they're not empty or mere rituals in that sense. They signify something within an entire language that we need to learn and understand when we are reading these texts. So we have to make that effort, and it is an act of translation, as I said at the beginning. And what we are trying to achieve, I think, more than anything else, is some sort of an idea of epistemic justice, not just moral justice, or not just, human rights, as Professor Clooney said, but, how to do justice in terms of the moral economy of knowledge, on which ultimately the idea of varnashrama dharma is based. So that is something much more complex than merely worrying about class or rituals and things like this.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We'll have to wrap up now. And in interest of time, we're already 5 minutes over. But thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I think it just provided us a very, very different and deep and insightful perspective into how, in this modern world which is governed by technology and media, and where perpetual knowledge passed on between generations has been a dominant source of information on religion and its teaching, and their reading of the religious text has really taken a back seat, not a very high priority. I think you all have instigated, at least to me, in my mind, to engage in reinterpreting our traditional texts, which may hold the key to providing solutions to some of the social issues that we face today. But I would like to just take on this very last minute, to pass on a big thanks to our audience for joining us, a very strong audience, staying in large numbers out there, listening to our panelists, and very intently listening to the panelists, the wonderful questions. To the team at the Mithil Institute, both in India and Boston, especially Angarika and Shreya. I know Professor Clooney mentioned at the beginning, but really a big thanks to both of you at the Delhi office for your work in putting together this session. And very importantly, our panelists today, Ananya, Professor Clooney, Professor Oliver. It was really a very insightful session. Thank you for sharing your deep knowledge into the Hindu text and your perspective on their interpretation. Thank you so much. Wishing everyone joining us from the West a very good morning again. Have a great day ahead, and good evening and good night to the people joining from the East. Thank you so much. Take care. Enjoy your day and the evening.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks much.
Bye. Thank you all.
Bye. Bye, everyone.